Jim Robinson is a renowned academic, and it's along with Daron Acemoglu and Simon Johnson, the most recent Nobel laureate. Just almost a year ago, he was awarded the economics Nobel Prize. And let me take that out of the way. So it's really important that we have it. But I want to mention something else. I get to know about Jim many years ago. I think he was a young assistant professor at the University of Southern California. Was that your first postdoc?
Second. I was at the University of Melbourne first.
Okay. So I missed the first part of his academic career. But I listened to him during a presentation. I think it was about income distribution and economic development in a LACEA meeting in Bogota. That was probably in the 90s. That's probably going to date us both. And that was, at the time, a really innovative issue. The idea was that economic performance depends not only on technical issues, but depends also on distributional issues. And when we talk about distributional issues, the issues of politics, of coalitions, come in mind. And one thing that Jim had from the very beginning, early in his career, he was not afraid to move into issues that were really important, but may not have been in fashion at the time. And he has been a trailblazer in that sense. Now, in all honesty, maybe around the late 80s and the 90s, economists start to bring the idea of how to incorporate politics in the thought about economics and economic development. But it was a little bit insulting and patronizing the first efforts. I remember a very well-known Princeton professor, I was at NYU at the time, who came to provide a political economy talk. And he started saying, well, we are bringing now ways into formalize politics and to bring models, and that's helping politics move from philosophical issues and kind of a discursive approach to a much more scientific approach. That's not the way in which Jim Robinson and his co-authors are taking. They take seriously politics, they take seriously the rule of roles, they take seriously the role of what we learn from history, and they incorporate it and they very much enrich the way we think about these issues. And this is what we are going to hear in his keynote speech, Productive Policies for Return. Jim?
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Azarud, for that generous introduction. I'm very happy to be here today talking about political economy and coalition formation, but I'm going to try to do something a little bit different in this talk, in the sense of, I chose the title Productive Politics. So what I've noticed, and, possibly I'm somewhat responsible for this, which is a kind of terrifying thought, is that when people start talking about politics, whether it be at the World Bank or the University of Chicago, or wherever it is, then people think of politics as being this kind of evil thing. They think of politics as being something that kind of messes up good policy and blocks reform initiatives, and there's rent seekers and vested interests and all of that, And, I've done some work on that. And it's not that those mechanisms aren't necessarily relevant, but what I want to talk about today is actually we should think about politics in a different light. We should think about politics in a much more kind of constructive and productive way, and that's what I want to talk about today. So let me have a go at it, and here I go. Okay, no, I have to point this in the right direction, probably. Okay, no. Whoops, okay. All right, that got it going. All right, so I'm going to tell you about the birth of politics. Okay, I'm sort of making this up. I don't actually know that this is really the birth of politics. But what I've realized is after you get the Nobel Prize, you can basically say anything you like, and everyone has to believe that it's true. But you're all too sophisticated for that to work, you know, here. So that's why I'm making fun of myself. Okay, so let me tell you about this place. So this is a place in, you know, this is a place in southern Turkey called Göbekli Tepe. And it's the world's oldest, you know, to our knowledge now, the world's oldest freestanding building. Okay, so it's on top of a hill, and it's overlooking that Syria in the background. This is really on, you know, what the great University of Chicago archaeologist Robert Braidwood called the hilly flanks. You know, the hilly flanks, you know, which is where kind of agriculture and domestication of plants first started in the Middle East. Okay, and you can see these enormous stone pillars. Some of them are 10 tons. They were lugged from several miles away up this hill and kind of stuck there. Now, what's fascinating about Göbekli Tepe is that this thing was constructed before the domestication of plants and animals. Okay, so these were not even sedentary societies. There was no city in Göbekli Tepe. There was no permanent residences in Göbekli Tepe. So I want to talk about what on earth induced people to lug these huge stone kind of carvings, you can see them, and build these constructions on top of this hill, you know, when they weren't living there. There was no settlement, there was no agriculture, so people probably were not really sedentary at all. But anyway, they built this thing, okay? And I'm claiming it's the birth of politics, and you'll see why in a second. Now, there's several enclosures, and different enclosures have different animals carved on the pillars. So here you can see that's a fox on the right-hand side. That's in enclosure B. In enclosure C, you have boars and snakes in enclosure A. So what the archaeologists think is that these are probably clan totems. Okay, so this is like the fox clan, and there's the snake clan and the boar clan. Okay, so what's a clan? You know, a clan is a sort of fictional kinship group. It sort of brings some kind of common identity to people that otherwise wouldn't have it. Okay, so how? I'm pointing it in the wrong direction. No. Okay, here we are. Okay, so what's Göbekli Tepe a solution to? Well, it's a solution to the fundamental problem of human society, which is how to get people to cooperate at large scale. Okay, so one way of doing that is to invent collective identities, like being English, you know, or being a member of the Fox clan. Okay, so and you can have a totemic item that you don't eat. I don't know if people eat foxes at all anyway, but, you know, you could do. And, you know, you have greetings and you have names in common and things like that, okay? You devise rituals to kind of fortify. We do things together. We do things, you know, we have rituals that fortify this identity as a member of the Fox clan, you know, and we innovate the notion of a kind of sacred space where people congregate. The Fox clan comes and the boar clan comes and the snake clan, and we congregate, and that helps build these identities. Okay? Now, what's so special about ritual, for example? So here's a good question for those trying to understand the political economy of China. Like, what is about ritual? There's very little social science research on ritual, but here's an idea from the great political philosopher Jack Pocock, now sadly passed away. He actually wrote, he was mostly famous for his analysis of political thought in Western Europe, particularly medieval Florence. But, you know, he sort of got interested in Confucianism. And he wrote some very penetrating articles on, like, Confucianism, and particularly on this, why this emphasis on ritual. Here's his idea. To tell a man to do something is to call to his mind the possibility of not doing it. Okay, if I tell you to do something, I write a law which says you can't do this, or you can, you know, then that brings to mind the idea of, well, why should I do that? Maybe I won't do it. And he says rituals, since they're non-verbal, have no contraries. So his idea is, you know, we just get people going up the hill in Göbekli Tepe, we build these stones, we congregate in the clan enclosure, and, you know, it's non-verbal, we just sort of do it, and there's much less of anything that can be questioned or doubted. So so Pocock wrote about how rituals were a kind of very powerful basis for creating social order. Okay? So what I want to argue is, who came up with all of these things to help people cooperate? Who came up with this idea of a clan? Who came up with the rituals? Who said, let's build this enclosure on top of that hill and we'll lug these enormous things and erect it up? That was the politicians. Okay? There was a problem how to cooperate. What did the politicians do? They came up with ways to get people to cooperate. I think that's what politics is about for me. It's about doing something productive. It's about doing something constructive. It's about solving a problem. So, we talk a lot about politics as creating problems. I want to talk about politics as saving problems today. Okay. All right. Woo! Gosh. Okay. So as I said, it's become very common to think of politics as a friction. So in welfare economics, the first welfare theorem tells you, under certain conditions, a market allocation of resources is Pareto optimal. And then we have a checklist of things that can go wrong. Market failures, externalities, maybe economies of scale that mess up competitive markets, frictions, informational frictions, search frictions, etc. Okay, so the way that people have studied politics is to sort of think of it as a friction. We have this wonderful, we're calculating the optimal policy, we use public finance to figure out what the best intervention is or whatever, and then politics comes along and sort of messes it up. So it becomes a kind of pathology like externalities, or market failures. All right, so I think that's not the right way to think. Obviously, that's not the way that politicians think about politics, but it's the way that many economists working in political economy have come to think about it. It's something that gets in the way, okay? And who's in the way? Let me give you a diagram that I find very useful for thinking about this, that comes from an old book by Everett Rogers on the diffusion of innovation. So Rogers was interested in, you invent something like artificial intelligence, okay? So how does that spread? Who uses artificial intelligence? Who's in favor of it? Could people be against it? Like people like university professors who see themselves out of a job, because artificial intelligence comes and teaches their class, and they don't do research anymore because now you just ask ChatGPT, what's a good research question? What's the research design? Can you produce a regression to show that? There you are. Why do you need a professor anymore? You see, so I could be a vested interest there. All right. So Rogers produces this diagram, which I'm going to use for talking about examples in the talk. And there's an innovation, but you could think about that in your space as there's a new policy, or there's a policy reform, or there's an institutional reform. You want to change the way things happen. You want to make the central bank independent, or you want to privatize some parastatal, or you want to reorganize the education system. Okay, so who's doing that? You're doing it, the innovators. Okay, I'm going to say the politicians are doing it. Okay, so, and what Rogers said is there's a sort of distribution of people who are kind of, some are really in favor, the early adopters. They drank the Kool-Aid. Okay, they know how wonderful it is to have an independent central bank or whatever. So you don't have to persuade them. They're just like on board straight away. Okay, and then there's an early majority. Yeah, there's people who, okay, I can see the benefits, but there's problems, and, but they can be persuaded, all right? So you can think of a whole distribution, and at the end, there's what he calls the laggards. So don't take these numbers they come from some empirical work, but I don't take these numbers too seriously for today. But the laggards, who are the laggards? The laggards are the people, it doesn't matter what you do, they're never going to be convinced, okay? For whatever reason. They could be, economic losers from this. They could be just have normative preferences. They're just committed to the other way of doing things. Okay, it doesn't matter what you do. Some people are always going to be against it, in my experience. Okay, so that's what Rogers called them, the laggards. Okay, and I want to talk about sort of politics as being about, how you persuade these people to get things done. Okay. So I'm always pointing this in the wrong direction. Okay. Oh, no, there you go, you see? All right. Oh my gosh. Come on, seriously? Okay. Okay. No, I'm really confused. Okay, all right. So the laggards. Okay, so you get the idea. Let me talk about a real example. Okay, so let me talk about a real example of the laggards. Okay, so and it comes from research I've done on the enclosure of common lands in Britain. So here's a parish called Barton upon Humber in the north of England. And this is what it looked like in the late 18th century. Okay? There were 3 big open fields, and there were commons, the Ings on the River Humber, cow pasture, horse pasture. There was some common wold down in the bottom. And in these big open fields, the farmers, the people who lived in the parish, had strips scattered across these different fields. Okay, so this is what medieval, this is what feudal medieval British, much of Western European agriculture looked like. So this, now in this process, so a lot of in the 18th century, many contemporaries pointed out, argued this was very inefficient. They actually collected data, they did natural experiments, it's extremely sophisticated, trying to show that this way of organizing agriculture impeded innovation. You had to have a lot of coordination, you have to have local collective mechanisms for getting people to cooperate. Okay, and there was a mechanism for changing this. So if all the citizens of the parish agreed, they could reorganize property rights. Okay, so you had to have complete unanimity, and then you could take these fields and reorganize them and privatize them. But, if you think about Rogers' diagram, there's always the laggards. So it's very hard to have perfect consensus, at least in Western society. I'm going to come to that. So what happened? It was stuck. Okay, Barton on Humber was stuck. People made some attempts to enclose, but it didn't happen because there's always the laggards. So the laggards got in the way. All right. So what happened? Okay. Well, the politicians came to the rescue. What did the politicians do in the guise of the British Parliament? Okay. The British Parliament created a new mechanism to enclose. This is what happened. On the right-hand side, you see Barton on Humber after enclosure. All of the commons disappeared, the 3 big fields disappeared, all the land was divided up into individual farms for the people who had rights in the commons and the open fields. So the land was privatized, they built lots of roads and things like that. Okay? So on the other side, on the right, on the left-hand side, they were stuck until the late 18th century. And then when Parliament changed the rules, this happened. Okay? So what did Parliament do? Parliament changed the procedure so that instead of needing unanimity, if 3/4 of the people agreed, you could privatize. Okay? You could enclose. Okay? So they created a mechanism. Basically, they dropped the condition that you had to have unanimity. What was the economic consequences of that? Enormous increases in agricultural productivity, about a 50% increase in agricultural productivity, greater technology adoption, etc. Okay, so the economic benefits were real, but there was a political problem that had to be solved in order to take advantage of those productivity benefits. Okay. All right. Okay. All right, all right, okay. So I'm going to call this the reverse image, okay? So I gave you an image of politics, and I'm trying to give you a different image, which is here, people couldn't cooperate. There were the laggards. So the politicians provided a mechanism to solve that problem, okay? So what were the laggards worried about? Well, some of them were just committed to this is the way we do things. In England, we're obsessed with things that happened time out of mind. This is the way English people do things. And the way English people do things should never change. So there's people like that, but of course there were also distributional consequences. So in the research we show there was a big impact of enclosure on land distribution, for example. There was a significant increase in land distribution. So what were the consequences of that? Not a lot. There were some protests, not many protests, because the process was extremely legalistic, very legalistic. There were lots of checks and balances, and people saw it as being legitimate, even if they didn't like the end result. Okay, so I want to think of the reverse image is, politics is mostly not about the objections of the laggards, but it's about strategies to overcome those objections. And I like this example because it shows, ultimately everyone kind of bought into this. Yeah, sure, there were some losers, in different ways, normatively or positively, but there was very little discontent. People kind of moved on, all right? Okay, so let me give you some more examples. So that's the image I'm trying to get across. Let me give you some more examples. So think about a situation where you're a policymaker, and you're in a decision. You have to make a decision. You want to implement a reform. Build an institution, change something. And there's a distribution, like I showed you. There's the early adopters who are all in favor. There's the early majority who can be easily persuaded. There's minorities or laggards, who might exercise some sorts of veto powers or objection. And as I say, majority rule is not everything. In Africa, in my experience, nobody ever wants to do something by a majority. You want everybody. You want everyone to buy in, okay? So you want to have consensus over a decision. You want everyone to be kind of something close to unanimity. As I said earlier, that's kind of unimaginable in Western society. But in my experience, that's the norm in an African context, okay? So what I want to do is just talk about some political strategies that might help you. And I do these, in the spirit of, here's some kind of real productive politics in action, okay? Now, of course, strategy number one is something really obvious, which is, okay, can we structure things in such a way as to minimize the number of laggards? So here's an example since I was talking about 18th century Britain, here's another example from 18th century Britain. So the Glorious Revolution happened in 1688, the creation of kind of constitutional government in Britain. It was the first time a modern fiscal system was built, okay? But who did they tax, okay? Not rich people. They created an excise tax system. The excise tax system was tax on, the production of bread and beer and butter and things that poor people consumed. Where was rich people's wealth? Land, okay? So after the Glorious Revolution, they bureaucratized the excise tax system. They created a modern bureaucratized excise tax system. What do they do to the land tax? Nothing. They left it alone. They never bureaucratized the land tax. Why was that? Because they didn't want landed elites to oppose the institutional changes that they were doing, okay? So if you look at the data, for example, very inelegantly scanned from John Brewer's great book, you can see that as excise tax revenues rocket up, the land tax withers away, okay? So the tax that was borne by the richest people in Britain withers away, was never bureaucratized. Why is that? Well, you're trying to keep the landowners happy. Okay, so this is not the advice you'd get from public finance. Excise taxes, it's very, it's not a progressive tax, it's a regressive tax, but this was somehow what it took to build fiscal institutions and get things going ahead. Okay, another great example. Okay. Okay, another great example, there's lots of examples of this, but let me give you a Chinese example, which comes from Ying Yi Qian's book on how China reformed. Okay, so Ying Yi has a great table where he sort of compares, looking at the first decade of the transition in China, and he compares what happens to employment in state-owned enterprises. So that's, this is, state-owned enterprises. So state-owned enterprises, maybe they're the laggards. People in the state-owned enterprises might be concerned about market reforms or the transition, and what do? Leave them alone. Okay? In fact, state-owned employment in state-owned enterprises actually increases over this first decade. But what happens in non-state employees? What happens in employment in the private sector? It goes through the roof. Okay? So here, state-owned enterprises are sort of left alone. They're the potential laggards. Just leave them alone, like the British aristocracy. They're still left alone, the British aristocracy. But you allow private sector to flourish on the margin. Okay? So here, this is like structuring the reform in such a way as, you know, to keep the laggards happy. So everyone's on board. Okay? Okay. So, you know, I was saying, put the laggards at ease, pretend you're not doing anything new. So one thing that's kind of remarkable about many of these experiences is the way they're pretty radical, but everyone pretends they're not doing anything. Like the Meiji Restoration. The Meiji Restoration wasn't doing anything, it was just restoring the system that had been there before. That was total nonsense. It was a massive innovation culturally, ideologically, institutionally, but everyone pretended they weren't doing anything. The Glorious Revolution, same thing. We're not doing anything, we're just restoring the rights of the traditional Englishmen and English women, you know. So, you know, Confucius, same thing. Confucius said, I'm not innovating at all, I'm just trying to restore, you know, the way things worked, you know, in the good old days in China, all right? So one strategy is this, in many examples, is actually pretend you're not doing anything new, actually. No, there's nothing to worry about. This is just the same thing, okay, even if it is radical, okay? Now, that, you know, that doesn't necessarily work, okay? So often you see the complete opposite of that, meaning if it doesn't work to pretend you're not doing anything, you have to really show that you're doing something, okay? So, you know, if you want to change equilibria, sometimes you have to do something very symbolic, okay? So, you know, we need to get a new clicker. Here's my favorite example of doing something really symbolic, which is, you know, Nelson Mandela supporting the Springboks, getting his Springbok jersey on and showing up when the Springboks won the Rugby World Cup, okay? So you know, this is, you know, here's like, oh my gosh, you know, something really symbolic about South Africa. There's a new South Africa, okay? Something really, you know. So here's, you know, this is just, you know, something, okay, the equilibrium is really changing, okay? I'm going to hang out with the white rugby players. Hard to imagine before that, but there he is cheering for the Springboks. Probably before that, you know, people were like hoping the Springboks lost, you know, like Spaniards, you know, like Catalans hoping the Spanish national team loses. Okay. All right. Colombia is a great example of doing something visible also. When President Uribe came to power, you know, he had a strategy for like trying to convince people that something was going to change. Okay. And, you know, the way he did that was, you know, the day he became president, you know, instead of hanging out drinking champagne as one does, you know, he got on a plane and he went up to Valledupar in the north of Colombia. So what did he do in Valledupar? He opened up the roads. Okay. The roads at this time in Colombia, you know, were extremely unsafe. Like nobody drove anywhere. You know, I remember if you drove outside Bogota, you had to like duct tape, you know, wads of pesos underneath the wheel arch in case you got stopped and robbed. And, you know, this went on. This is called, they call this in Colombia, pesca milagrosa, like magical fishing. This is a magical fishing. You know, you stop someone, maybe there's somebody good to kidnap and things like that. That's a magical fishing in Colombia. That's the euphemism, all right? So President Uribe, this killed the roads in Colombia, okay? So what did President Uribe do? He put the military on the roads. He went up to Valledupar and he opened the roads. He put the army on the roads. And the army sat there like putting their thumb up to drivers. I remember everyone saying, he's gone bananas. Shouldn't those people be fighting the guerrilla? What are they doing on the roads? But actually, it was a piece of fantastic politics, you know, because suddenly everybody was talking about it. They thought, oh my gosh, the roads are safe. People went out. They started driving. One of my friends in Bogota drove to the coast, to the Caribbean coast, 1,000 kilometers for the weekend, just because he could for the first time in like 20 years, just for the heck of it. He went to Santa Marta, he stayed the night, and he drove back the next day, just because he could. So it had this enormously symbolic effect, kind of, and it has all these externalities. People get back, and then on the streets, people are out there, very symbolic. It looked like a crazy thing, but it was easy to do. It was very fast to do, okay? And it had a very big effect. Okay, so this is the opposite. Now I'm going to get a bit more Machiavellian, which is, and one of the best books, if you're interested in these ideas, I'm going to run out of time soon, but one of the best books, if you're interested in these kind of ideas, is Robert Caro's biography of Robert Moses. So Robert Moses was the man who ran New York City for about 40 years and was responsible for enormous numbers of infrastructural projects, Jones Beach, the Lincoln Center, all sorts of things, okay, roads, infrastructure, etc. And one thing that, Moses points out is that, that Caro points out is that Moses was very kind of ambiguous often in what he was intending to do. Okay, so there's a very nice book by Ronald Archer, an economist, Ronald Archer, who compares the politics of Perón to the politics of Salvador Allende, and he sort of says, Allende's problem was it was so clear what he wanted to do, he mobilized every single person who was opposed to that in a coalition against him. So sometimes you have to be a little ambiguous about what you want to do, because otherwise you're going to galvanize opposition. Okay, so this maybe is a bit Machiavellian, but this is just, I won't go into this. This is from Caro's book. This is just all the different things that Moses did. Okay, so one thing you can also do, which you see in many successful examples, I'm going to give some in a second, is we think of like patronage as a dirty word. Think of patronage as compensation. Okay, many examples of institution building feature things that you could call patronage, but you could also call them compensation. For example, I'm going to give some more Nigerian examples, but if you go back now, of course, Mr. Tinubu is the president of Nigeria, but back in the day when he was governor of Lagos State in the early 1990s, one of the first things he did was there were massive attempts to kind of beautify infrastructure and beautify the city. Okay, so very symbolic. Also great politics. Why is that? You have to hire huge numbers of people. Okay, if you want to clear up the trash, you have to hire a lot of people. So very symbolic again, but good politics. President Uribe, back to President Uribe. So one of the things that President Uribe did, was every Saturday he'd take his ministers out somewhere in rural Colombia to some place mostly where no Colombian president had ever been in the previous 200 years in helicopters, and set up a stage and hold what he called a Consejo Comunal. Okay? So what was a Consejo Comunal? Well, on the one hand, it was state building. It was bringing the state to rural areas where it had never been before. Okay? It was giving people access to ministers who they'd never even seen, unimaginable. But it was also patronage. It was also distributing favors to municipalities. So President Uribe, there was state building, but there was good politics also involved along with the state building. Okay? I could talk about President Park. I've been doing some research on President Park recently. Same kind of thing. Here he is on the right-hand side. Yes, President Park was obsessed with exporting and generating economic development, but he was also very good at distributing compensation, let me call it. Okay, there he is, distributing compensation. That's in his own museum in Seoul. So, Okay, man, this is so annoying. All right, okay. So here's a strategy also that you see very often. This is like super painful, but probably every politician knows this. You let people take credit for things they didn't do, okay? So Robert Moses was a genius at this. So he built Jones Beach State Park. And Franklin Roosevelt at the time was the governor of New York State. And Roosevelt blocked him. He wouldn't give him access to the land. He wouldn't cooperate. And Moses hated him. And then he invited him to the inauguration of Jones Beach State Park. Okay? And Moses stood up in front of Roosevelt and said, without the genius and insight of Franklin Roosevelt, this would never have happened. Okay? So, Antanas Mokas, when he was mayor of Bogota, was very good at this too, you know. And as Harry Truman, former President Truman, said, it's amazing what you can accomplish if you don't care who gets the credit. Okay? I think you understand that at the World Bank as well. Okay. There's also something that Moses called the oops, sorry technique. What's the oops, sorry technique? The oops, sorry technique is, as he put it, once you sink the first stake, they never make you pull it up. Okay? Meaning, you just get on with it. You know, unfortunately, you know, that doesn't always, I'm not going to say what I was going to say. So, you know what I was going to say, so I don't have to say it. So the oops, sorry technique. Okay. You know, sequencing, I talked about, you know, design things to minimize the amount of losers. Not always possible, but the sequencing is also very important in addition to that. Okay? That's something that President Uribe understood very well. If you read his autobiography, you know, he understood that fighting the FARC was going to take years. These people are off in rural areas and mountains where there's no people living, so it's really hard to kind of get credit for that. So you need to do something fast that you can get credit for, that people see is visible. And I think in Nigeria, this is Governor Fashola, who's followed President Tinubu as governor of Lagos State. There's also a very sophisticated sort of sequencing in the sense of, okay, we need the Okadas' support to win this election. After the election, we get rid of the Okadas from downtown Lagos. Okay. Sometimes I put this up here with some trepidation because I have to say I was never a fan of Mrs. Thatcher. Never a fan of Mrs. Thatcher. Never voted for her. Would never have voted for her. But I think what you have to say about Mrs. Thatcher is it's really hard to achieve things in politics, you know. And she achieved what she set out to do, okay? And sometimes, you know, as I said, there are laggards, and you just have to believe in what you're doing, and you have to fight, you know. I was living in England, you know, this is the miners' strike in the early 1980s. And I always remember my mother, you know, who was from the north of England. She was from Middlesbrough. She's from an area where there's like mines. And this gentleman on the left, Arthur Scargill, said, he announced, you know, we need to protect the mines for our children. And my mother's response to that was, what parent in their right mind would want their child working in a coal mine? So, anyway, you know, there you go. The lady's not for turning. All right, last idea. You know, back to Lagos. You need a vision. Where are you going? How are you going to inspire people? Okay, remember back to Göbekli Tepe. You know, they must have sold this a vision of this kind of temple on top of the hill. It's going to be beautiful. We can look over Syria. There's going to be pillars, and we're going to get together and drink beer, probably, according to what the archaeologists say. You know, so utopianism is a bit of a good thing. You know, it's a good thing. Like, you need a vision. You need some project to kind of inspire people. So I'm in favor of utopianism. Here's Echo Atlantic City. Maybe there's someone in the room who can tell me where we are with Echo Atlantic City. But this is the attempt to build a kind of mega city in Lagos Island, you know, and which received a lot of criticism. But like for me, I like the ambition. You know, I was just been in Brazil, and you know, Charles de Gaulle famously said about Brazil, Brazil is the country of the future, and always will be. Okay. Now, that's often taken as a negative thing about Brazil, but I don't think it's a negative thing at all, actually. It means that the Brazilians thought they were going to be the country of the future, and that's actually a good thing. Could you say that about Colombia? You know, I'm beating up on Colombia, but, you know, Colombia's in the room, they know me. You couldn't say that about Colombia. Colombians don't think they're the country of the future. Okay, Brazil, I think that's good. Okay, it's hard to be the country of the future. So what? You know, it's good to try. You know, what did Eisenhower say? He said, plans are useless, but planning is essential. Okay, so, all right. Dreaming and ambition are good. I like utopianism. Okay, so just this is my last slide. I'm over time. Just to say, you know, don't think of politics as a friction. Don't think of politics as, politics is the solution to lots of problems. I think that's the way that my friends who are politicians think about things. And it's not the way that we in political economy have sort of thought about that, okay? Of course, there are other mechanisms I'm not talking about here, okay? I could have talked about that, but I thought, that was going to be boring. It would be more fun to talk about this because it's kind of newer. I could talk about clientelism, and, I could talk about rent-seeking, and I could talk about vested interests, and yeah, those things are there, and maybe they inhibit launching a reform or launching a new policy or something like that. Okay, so when I talk about that diagram, I'm sort of thinking about, we're trying to do something. Okay, there are these. How do we get round these blockages? Okay, and why am I emphasizing that? Well, because I think in my experience, for example, in Colombia is, there's an enormous number of capable, well-intentioned people. Sure, there's politics and there's clientelism and stuff like that. But there's a lot of people trying to do stuff. And the problem is, how do you get that to happen? How do you get things to work? How do you get people to cooperate? How do you get people to go along? And that's what I wanted to kind of talk about there. And I think once you focus on that, then you see politics in a much more constructive light. So, all right, that's what I have. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to open it for a few minutes for questions and answers. You could ask whatever question you have in mind, but it has to be brief. Okay. Now, if you overextend yourself, I'm not gonna shut you down, but I'm gonna start making funny faces. Okay. So we're gonna take probably 3 questions. And then Jim will answer the one that he cares. Okay, so we start with that one. So 1, 2, and 3. Okay.
Hi, hi. My name is Ignacio Ibarzabal. Here, I'm from Argentina, a rugby fan, by the way. One question: how do you think about civil society? In supporting that politics is more of a lubricant than a restrainer of transformation. Thank you.
Okay. Can we take the 3?
Yes. Okay. Good.
Yeah, in the same table, and then there's one over here. And yes, as the previous guy did it, why don't you introduce yourself briefly and just do your question.
Okay.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Professor Robinson, for an amazing and very insightful presentation. If possible, please, I would like you to bring in, my name is Musa Shtewi, I'm from Jordan. If possible, please, I would like you to bring in international dimension to internal politics, if you can. Thank you.
Okay.
There was one question. Am I still here?
Yeah. Okay, so
okay, there's going to be 4 questions. It was the other guy, but there's going to be 4 questions. Go ahead.
Yeah, Bill Ferguson, Grinnell College, Iowa. Where does the distribution of power enter into your analysis?
Good question and very brief. That's the kind of questions that we like. Go ahead.
My name is Yael Cervantes. I'm from Mexico. And I have a question regarding what is the difference between the rule of law or the enforcement of the law and politics. Because I also see that, for example, in Colombia, putting like the security in the roads, I would think that that's enforcement of the law, which in econ, sometimes we see the government as the one who is going to set the rules and is going to enforce it, rather than politics. So I would like to, know what's the difference between the enforcement and the politics. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Well, I think, to go in reverse order, I think enforcement is about politics. I mean, so, the lack of the rule of law, or kind of, the anarchy in Colombia, is a problem of, the enforcement, but it's the problem of the state not enforcing the rule of law, So I think, in the case of President Uribe, obviously there was a sort of sea change in the government's attitudes towards that, meaning that President Uribe, passionately wanted to defeat the Marxist guerrilla group. And part of that, involved enforcing, rules and laws, some, not all, much more effectively. So I think politics is about the enforcement. I don't think enforcement is just a kind of technocratic issue. You have to create incentives, you have to get the right people, doing things, and that's about politics. I think, I don't know, you said I could only answer one, but I wanted to answer all of them. So I think like this question of the international dimension, I think, Professor Acemoglu and I were often accused of, neglecting the international dimension. And I think the reason for that is that any country I've always studied in any detail, the domestic politics always looms large, of course, it's not that in our theory, there are big kind of global events that shape the trajectory of different societies and institutions, like colonialism, for example, which we studied a lot, So, I think if you thought about the history of the Americas, obviously the different way that colonial societies were constructed had a huge impact on the way institutions formed. But after that, the way I guess I've come to think about it is then it's the internal dynamics of politics really takes over. And I think, what I see also is that, no matter what the international environment, countries can fail or they can thrive. Think about South Korea, South Korea, if you go to Seoul, Starbucks have bomb shelters underneath them. We don't have that in Chicago, not yet anyway. Like you're in Seoul, you're just, you're 50 kilometers from North Korea. There was never a peace agreement. Like South Korea has thrived in these kind of extraordinarily difficult circumstances, So I think like with just, think about Taiwan, same thing. Countries flourish in very difficult international contexts, or they can fail miserably in extremely, helpful international contexts. Like go back to Colombia, 1960s, the Alliance for Progress, the US government was all in favor of land reform. There was money, there was technical expertise, there was everything. What happened? Nothing happened, but that was the Colombian state couldn't implement it, that was didn't want to implement it. So I think, I think we could, reasonable people can disagree on this, and we should discuss any particular case we could, but that's just kind of where I've always been on this. I think, civil society is a kind of important part of this distribution of people, who can be involved, who can be, early majority, who can be really in favor, who you can work together. Like the way I talked about this, I sort of talked about it as, there's this distribution, I have to kind of win everybody over, But of course, if I win some people over, that helps me win other people over, because that's like you're building a coalition. If I get some people in society will help persuade other people in society. I didn't kind of emphasize that, but, I think bringing anybody on board like civil society is going to enormously help kind of the implementation of policy and making the policy kind of more legitimate and more effective.
Thanks a lot. Let's go for a second round of questions. Okay, let's try to distribute it evenly. So we're going to start here, there, and there. Those are okay. So we are going to start here. Go ahead. Yeah.
So my question is that when the powerful... The button is on the right. Okay. So my question is that when the powerful groups block reforms, so what's the best way for a government to still move forward?
Okay. Then let's have one there.
So what makes people choose some of these strategies? What explains that choice?
Okay, let me make sure if there's someone really in the back who wants to. No? Okay, then we go to the ones, we're here and then here. Huh? Okay, we're gonna do, okay.
Okay, what do you think about the digitalization and the government reform?
Okay. And if you could just briefly introduce yourself and where are you coming from?
Yeah, actually, my name is Bonchai. I am from the Ministry of Economic and Finance of the government of Cambodia.
Cambodia. Okay. So we're going to go here and there over there. Okay.
Rafael Edu, I'm from Benin, but I'm living here in the US. Don't you think that providing service that solves problem for people would be the best way to be successful in reforming different systems?
Why don't we give Jim a chance to answer these ones, and then we'll see if we have...
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. I'm not sure I understood the last question.
No, let me see if I understood your question properly. He said if providing services to people is a way to move forward. Is that...
Yes, when people are facing some problem, whether they are legal or not, we come to find solutions with them.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I mean, so, you know, what explains the choice of strategies? I think there's probably lots of constraints on the use of different sorts of strategies, or some things will be effective and other things won't be effective. I think, some of the things are always going to be important, like doing these kind of symbolic things and, trying to show people, either pretending there's no change or pretending there's dramatic change. So those things are kind of opposites. So you can't do both of those. You have to decide in the context what's going to be more effective. So in the context of South Africa in 1994, Nelson Mandela decided, okay, this is not a context in which we can pretend nothing is happening. Something has to happen. We have to end apartheid, and we have to show we're ending apartheid. So that's a case where the other strategy of kind of doing nothing, it's not really on the table. You see what I mean? So the context is going to determine which strategy you use. I think the Chinese case is interesting. If you read Ying Yiqian's book about how China reformed, it's actually not clear, whether that thing I described was because of some clever strategy. Like they decided, in Beijing that we have to keep these people happy, so we're just going to leave them alone. Okay? It could also just be how things were. Like those people were too powerful to actually be touched, basically. So those two things look very similar, kind of in equilibrium, but one of them is the genius of the Communist Party, and the other is, well, okay, that's just the kind of equilibrium we're playing. Those people are too powerful. We just, we can't touch them. So either way, it turns out to be a good way to transition, in the Chinese case without creating losers. But so I think, that's again to say, the choice of strategy depends on power relations. I didn't answer the question about power relations. It depends on power relations. It depends on, the particular context. Some of the strategies may not work at all. And maybe it depends on the politician, like this business of giving people credit for things they didn't do. That's hard, That's hard in research. I don't want to give someone credit for an idea I had. That's really painful. But sometimes it actually helps, it helps convince people that actually, this is the right way to do research, or this is a really good topic, and but maybe that's just difficult, it's just difficult for some people to do that. So there's a lot of personal variation as well. I mean, that's a great question to which I only have a partial answer. I mean, I think, providing services, that's more like some people are opposed because they don't understand how good this is. They don't understand how they'll benefit from the policy. So I think that what you're saying, sir, does fit into this, because some of these people who are opposed, they're opposed because you have to convince them that this is going to work. And when they see it works, they're like, okay, I'm on board. Yes. So I think that's the way I would think about your comment in this context. I think, powerful groups, block reforms, I think that's totally context specific. It's totally specific to who the groups are, what the issues are, what the conflict is, and how, and so I think it's very difficult to give a blanket statement about that. I would say, it's just very, very context specific.
Okay. We have a chance to go for our last round. So We're going to hear, then she's from Nigeria, and you made several references, so she's really eager to ask a question, and then we go there. Okay, let's start with you.
Thank you very much, Professor, for that excellent presentation. My question is it possible to use symbolism and visibility without actually effectuating change? And if yes, is that not in conflict with the analysis of reforms?
Thanks very much, and nice to see Professor Robinson again. I had an opportunity to moderate a session with you some years back. So, talking from the Nigerian context, I'm Nigerian. You talked very well about the laggards and how to work with the laggards, and I totally agree with that. But what about the political body, I don't know if it's opposition or whatever, that tries to dissuade the laggards? So even like you talked about the Eco-Atlantic, which became a very big deal. But what about the political body, the opposition, who have, you know, for selfish reasons, don't want to see the laggards to really see the benefits of these very good reforms?
Okay, let's go and take these two. We're going to go with a gentleman and then with you. Go ahead. Yeah?
Yes. Okay. My name is Valentine Ezulu from Nigeria also. My question is related to the presentation made by the Prof. He gave one typical example of a scenario in Colombia where he made reference to the FARC rebels carrying out what he called, in quote, miraculous fishing. I wanted to get more insight into what he meant by that miraculous fishing. Is this similar to the rebels coming to the street, onto the road, kidnapping people? I think I want to get a clear perspective on that, because these are kind of the scenarios we also have in some parts of Africa.
Of course.
So I need clarification on that. Thank you very much.
Okay, go ahead, and then we will close with Jaime Saavedra here.
Thanks very much. I'm Jenny Cargill from South Africa, and thanks for pulling up Nelson Mandela. He was a master at driving reforms and change in South Africa at the time he came in, but the party he led and leads now today, almost in its entirety, has become a laggard. And what we're looking at today is that we're looking at a lot of coalitions. And wondering just how you see the coalitions look very messy and they look very difficult to manage, and how you see your strategies in the light of sort of coalition politics and managing something that looks like you can, with some coherence, drive reforms through the society. Thanks.
We're going to take a last one here.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Robinson. I was wondering if the right title is productive policies or effective policies. Because, I mean, with a knife, you can cook a meal or you can kill someone, right? And if you have always the, say, power captured, right, by vested interest, I mean, a group of politicians that wants to just pursue their own interests, they could be extremely smart and follow any of these strategies in order to maintain that, and could be extremely effective, right, in doing all of these things, or a combination, in order to maintain precisely the status quo that they want. So the question, and they could be super effective, but then the question would be, yes, those policies would be, or strategies would be productive, but from their perspective, not from the perspective of the common well-being.
Yeah, I mean, so I agree with that comment. You know, I think I sort of alluded to that a little bit at the end. You know that, I think, if the government of Venezuela, got hold of these slides, they won't be using these strategies to promote, collective welfare of Venezuela. So, if I can say something so controversial in public. So but I think that's right. But I think. you know, what I want to emphasize is that, you know, okay, yes, there can be problems, but I think political economy is too much about the problems. It's all about the problems. And what we do is we sort of say there's this politics-free benchmark, you know, which public finance calculates. And then there's politics which kind of comes in to sort of mess things up. So that's a very one-sided kind of image, you know. So I think I want to make the image two-sided at least, you know, perhaps you could say. I mean, I think on miraculous fishing, sir. Yeah, exactly. You know, so the problem in Colombia was the roads were completely unsafe. You know, people were being stopped, people were being kidnapped, people were being robbed. You know, now if you drive around eastern Nigeria, you know that you get stopped every couple of kilometers, you know, by some police unit or by some military unit who want a little something, and you know. But let me make an observation about that. You know, so that everyone complains about that in eastern Nigeria, and everyone, you know, has a story about that and whatever. You know, but in between Nsukka, I'm a fellow of the Institute of African Studies at the University of Nigeria at Nsukka. So I'm in Nsukka every summer. And in the road between Nsukka and Enugu, that was like that. And then these gangsters appeared, like serious criminals appeared. And suddenly, everyone's attitude towards the police changed. And people were stopping and giving the police money and giving them food. And it's very interesting. You know, so somehow that equilibrium is not so difficult to change in Nigeria, where people stop seeing the police and the army as a problem, but actually see them as a solution to a problem. You know, and it was dramatic, absolutely dramatic. Everybody, we were rolling the car window down and chatting with the military people, you know, because suddenly people were more, okay, this is the problem they're solving, actually. So I think that's, you know, it's a different scenario. In the Colombian case, these were mafias or they were Marxist guerrillas or stuff. They weren't people working for the government, you know. But anyway, so that's what miraculous fishing is about. I mean, you know, I think, you know, again, this question of you can have visibility and whatever. You know, the French intellectual Roland Barthes, many years ago, 50 years ago, wrote an article about politics as a wrestling match, basically. Like, politics was a wrestling match. You know, in a wrestling match, it's all completely fake. You know, it's totally fake. It's just entertainment. You know, it's like the spectacle. And we don't expect anything to happen. We just kind of enjoy the spectacle, you know. So of course, there's some sorts of politics are like that, you know, and you know, unfortunately. But as I said, you know, in my personal experience, you know, people get into politics because they want to change things. They want to change the world. They want to change the society. They want to. So yeah, you can have theatrics for its own sake, you know. But I'm pointing out here. I'm trying to point out that these symbolic things are actually very powerful at achieving good things. That's kind of what I wanted to say. I'm not sure I can speak to South African coalition politics. That's a long discussion. For sure.
They are checking if we have time, 1 more minute or not. They are having a discussion. Okay. So I wonder if I could use I could use this to make actually a question. I'm supposed to moderate it, but that's part of the distribution of politics of I was mentioning before that that last year there were 65 elections around the world, and in 64 of those countries, the incumbent lost a share of their votes. In many of those countries, sufficiently so that their parties lost power. And these tend to point out to two issues. One is the citizens are much more proactive now. They found that they have a say through the ballot boxes. But also they are showing their frustration with the kind of services they are receiving. In the case of the UK, it's associated with the National Health Institute. It is very specific in many countries, but it seems to be a trend. Now, in a context like that, it's politically profitable to polarize.
Yeah.
So that you could distinguish from the incumbent, and actually was very. But once you get into that, it's very difficult to get agreements. In the good old days, once politicians were elected, they very often would say, I'll govern for everybody. Now it seems that it's a good strategy to keep pulling in different directions. How do you see these ideas, and how do you think coalitions could be still pushing in a context of high polarization?
Yeah, I mean, of course, you know, we're in a moment where there's a lot of polarization in the world. You know, in some sense, democracy is a system, you know, which is supposed to deal with the problem that, you know, different people have different preferences, different people have different views about what the priority of society should be, different people have different views about what policy should be. And, you know, in a kind of Western-style democracy, there's a sort of winner, you know, and we take it in turns. You know, you're in power now, okay, fine, you know, but I get a chance to be in power next time, and that's somehow the way that you balance these interests. Now, you could say, of course, when it gets more polarized, it's more difficult to sustain that equilibrium. You know, in some sense, Daron and I wrote a book about that 20 years ago. It gets more difficult, and then, sure, you know, democracy stops working as a way of sort of resolving these differences in resolving these differences in society. You know, I always like, you know, if you ever read the essays that Julius Nyerere wrote in the 1950s and 1960s about, you know, Western-style democracy in Africa, he sort of points out that, you know, well, this is very polarizing. You know, having these two-party majoritarian systems is extremely polarizing, you know, and we don't want that in Africa. Because it's going to lead to polarization alongst, you know, communal lines, amongst regional lines and whatever. And anyway, it's not the way Africans made decisions traditionally, you know. So he was opposed to this kind of majoritarian-style democracy for, I think, very good reasons, actually. You know, no one discusses things like that anymore because we're not allowed to talk about things like that, you know. But if you go back to the 1960s, you were allowed to talk about things like that. And I think what Nyerere wrote was actually very, 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 very insightful and clever. So I think, you know, what can one do about that type of polarization? I think the answer is, you know, you have to find some alternative issue. You know, you have to find something that kind of cuts across, you know, the basis of this polarization, you know, like you're polarized on particular issues, you know. So what cuts across that, you know? Like, is there some way of finding, oh yeah, you know, if you read, for example, James Madison's, I really recommend it, James Madison's Diaries of the Constitutional Convention. So when the US wrote the Constitution, they agreed there was going to be no written record of the debate. But Madison, sneaky guy, went home every night and wrote up his notes. Now, he never published it until he died. So it was published in the 1840s, and he published his notes. So there's a lot of that going on today. In fact, one of the reasons we have the Electoral College, you know, today is because that was exactly an issue that was intended to break up polarization. So what does that mean? Big states versus little states. So under the Articles of Confederation, all the states got the same representation irrespective of what their population size was. So the big states like Virginia was like, no, we're going to get rid of that, you know. And the little states like Delaware said, no, we need to keep that, you know. So there was like this polarization. Think about slavery. The southern states had slavery. The northern states were opposed to slavery. Massively polarized. Like, how do you get these people to agree on anything? Well, Madison spent the whole time throwing in these issues that kind of cut across he was a master at it, cut across these kind of cleavages, you know, trying to come up with ways of, yeah, you know, that's a problem, but actually, you know, the real issue is this, you know, and persuading people to kind of realign. So, of course, that's easier said than done, but I think that's the kind of the wisdom of political science on that topic.
Well, thanks a lot, Jim. Thanks for this fantastic presentation, and thank you for being here.